Chicago, the Windy City. The hustle and bustle of daily life was everywhere you looked, as people rushed from one place to another, caught up in the rhythm of the city. The noise of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of the crowds filled the streets as the city seemed alive, vibrant, and full of energy. But beneath the surface of this urban sprawl, something was stirring. Something dark, something ancient. Few knew about it, and even fewer dared to speak of it. Yet, for decades, whispers had spread about Chicago's hidden, forgotten past. A past entwined with dark forces that no one truly understood. Old-timers, the ones who'd been around long enough to remember, would often talk about it. If you listened closely enough, you might hear them speak in hushed voices at night, sharing their unsettling tales with anyone who would listen. They spoke of a time when the city was much younger, of a curse buried deep beneath its streets, of the ancient spirits that once roamed freely in the land before it was ever paved over and built up. They said it was just a myth, a legend, but the way they said it, with their eyes wide and their voices trembling, suggested otherwise. There were stories of strange disappearances, of people lost without a trace, of things that shouldn't have been there. But those stories were always dismissed, laughed off as mere superstition. Those who dared to ask too many questions or dig too deep into the city's past often disappeared. Some said they were simply unlucky. Others said they knew too much. But the truth had been buried for far too long. Then, one night, everything changed. A report hit the news that caught everyone's attention. It was supposed to be just another routine health update, but the details were chilling. There was a strange illness spreading rapidly across the city, with more and more people showing up at local hospitals, complaining of severe headaches, nausea, and dizziness. At first, it seemed like the usual flu that tended to make the rounds during the winter months. People thought little of it. The media shrugged it off, and the city went on with its business. But something was different about this one. People started to show strange symptoms. Their skin turned an unnatural shade of pale. Their eyes became bloodshot, like something was eating them from the inside. Small rashes appeared on their bodies, but no one could explain what they were. The illness didn't behave like anything that had been seen before. Normally, people with flu-like symptoms would recover within a few days, but these people didn't. They just kept getting worse. The fever spiked higher and higher, and the pain seemed unrelenting. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Emergency rooms filled up quickly as people flooded in, desperate for answers. Nurses and doctors worked long hours trying to treat them, but no one knew what they were dealing with. Some patients experienced hallucinations, their minds slipping away, lost in fever dreams. Others fell into comas and never woke up. What was most troubling was the way some of them looked at the people trying to help them. Their gazes became cold, hollow, as if they weren't even human anymore. The first death wasn't too shocking. It was the usual procedure. A few more deaths followed, but still, no one was alarmed. After all, it was just another flu season, right? It wasn't until a few days later that the true horror began to unfold. More people started to disappear. Entire families. A man would go out to buy groceries, and the next day, he would be found missing. A woman would go for a walk in the park and never come back. Some vanished from their homes without a trace. Doors left wide open, lights still on, and food left half-eaten on the kitchen table. The police were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no blood. It was as if they had simply vanished. No one seemed to know where they had gone. Not a single clue was left behind. Soon, the rumors began to spread. People were starting to talk, and fear gripped the city. People started to suspect the illness wasn't just some flu. It wasn't a cold virus. Something much worse was at play. Something that the city wasn't prepared for. Then came the first body. It was found late one night in an alley near the south side. It was so mangled, so terribly mutilated, that it almost didn't seem real. The body was torn apart, as if it had been savaged by wild animals. But there were no animal tracks, no bloodstains, no signs of any creature nearby, no claw marks or bite wounds from any known predator. Just the remains of a human being, torn to pieces in a way that made no sense. The victim was unrecognizable, their face shredded beyond belief, their body disfigured beyond repair. At first, the police thought it was some kind of gang initiation or a ritualistic killing. But the more they examined the body, the more they realized it wasn't a normal homicide. The damage was too brutal, too savage. It was something worse, and the city started to whisper. As the bodies began to pile up, the city felt as though it was becoming a ghost town. People stayed indoors, too terrified to venture outside after dark. The streets, once full of life, became eerily quiet. The stores closed earlier. The traffic died down. and the usual hum of the city was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Even the most hardcore Chicagoans began to feel it. The feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with fear, and it clung to every corner of the city, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't long before someone made the connection. The deaths, the illness, the disappearances, they were all linked. But to what? To who? No one had the answers. Not the doctors, not the police, not the government. Theories swirled like smoke in the wind, but no one could say for sure what was happening. It was as if the city itself had turned on its inhabitants. Those who had been infected started to change. Slowly at first, but the symptoms grew worse. It wasn't just the pale skin or the bloodshot eyes anymore. They were changing in other ways. Their behavior became erratic, almost animalistic. They started to attack others, biting, scratching. Their strength grew beyond what any normal human could possess. People who had once been ordinary, kind-hearted citizens were now tearing into each other, driven by some primal urge to feed. The infection was spreading rapidly, faster than anyone could have imagined. Chicago, a city built on resilience, now found itself on the brink of collapse. The calm before the storm had passed, and in its wake, there was only one thing left: chaos. As the days slipped by, the atmosphere in Chicago grew increasingly tense. The hospitals, which had once been bustling with the routine hum of emergency rooms and waiting rooms, became overwhelmed. At first, the staff thought it was just another spike in seasonal illnesses, an uptick in flu cases, perhaps, or a viral outbreak. But soon, the situation spiraled out of control. The emergency rooms filled up so quickly that patients were left waiting in the hallways, unable to get immediate care. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, trying to tend to everyone, but the strain was beginning to show. They were exhausted, barely holding on to their sanity. And then the strange cases started to appear. People weren't just dying. They were coming back. It started subtly at first, with a few reports of patients waking up after being declared dead. The doctors didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was just a freak anomaly, a few instances of people being misdiagnosed. But then, more cases came in. The dead weren't just waking up, they were changing. The bodies of the deceased began to rot, their flesh darkening in unnatural ways. Their eyes, once dull and lifeless, now glazed over, as though something was looking through them. But it wasn't just a corpse that had reanimated. It was something else entirely. One evening, A group of doctors and nurses were working late in the hospital. The emergency room was quieter than usual, the phones barely ringing, and the lights flickered ominously above them. There was a lingering feeling of unease in the air, like something was about to happen, but no one could pinpoint exactly what. The morgue, located on the lower level of the hospital, was usually a place of quiet routine. It was where the dead were stored, awaiting autopsies or identification. The doctors and nurses often joked about it, trying to make light of the grim work that went on there. But tonight was different. Around midnight, one of the nurses, Marissa, heard a strange noise coming from the morgue. At first, she thought it was just the air conditioning kicking on, or the pipes groaning under pressure. But then, she heard it again, a soft, scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor. A chill ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She stood still for a moment, straining to hear any other sounds. The noise came again, closer this time. Slowly, she turned to her colleagues, but they hadn't heard it. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. One of the doctors, Dr. Michaels, looked up from the paperwork he was going over. He hadn't heard the noise, but shrugged it off. "Probably just rats, Marissa. Don't worry about it." But Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She stood there for a moment, trying to calm herself. Then, almost instinctively, she began walking toward the morgue. The long hallway to the lower level was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows along the walls. The door to the morgue was ajar, and the sound of dragging continued to echo in the stillness. She hesitated, then pushed the door open, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone down there?" No response. Marissa stepped inside. The morgue was cold and sterile, the faint scent of antiseptic filling the air. The refrigerated drawers lined the walls, each one holding the body of someone who had passed away in the hospital. It was a place that should have been quiet and lifeless. But tonight, it was different. As Marissa stepped deeper into the room, her eyes caught sight of something moving. A body, one that had been dead for several days, shifted. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. She blinked hard, trying to focus. But there it was again. The body on the far side of the room, its limbs twitching. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she realized what she was seeing wasn't natural. The body was moving, slowly, stiffly, as if it were struggling to come back to life. She froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from behind her. She spun around, but before she could react, the door slammed shut. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the morgue into darkness. Panic surged through Marissa's chest, and her heart began to race. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She fumbled for her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but before she could find it, something grabbed her from behind. A sharp pain shot through her arm, followed by a sickening, tearing sound. She screamed, a high-pitched cry that echoed through the morgue. Her body jerked violently as the thing, whatever it was, sank its teeth deep into her flesh. Her blood splattered across the cold floor as she fought to break free. The pain was unbearable, but the strength of the grip on her arm was inhuman. Marissa managed to tear herself away and stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. The thing, no longer a person, but a twisted mockery of one, staggered toward her. Its face was bloated and rotting, the skin peeling away to reveal the raw muscle beneath. Its eyes were empty, void of any recognition. It wasn't a living person anymore. It was something else, a creature driven by hunger, by instinct. She turned to run, but the morgue door wouldn't budge. She yanked at the handle, her breath shallow, desperate. Then she heard the slow, dragging footsteps behind her. She could feel the cold presence getting closer and closer. Marissa spun around and saw the thing coming for her again, its mouth open, its rotten teeth gleaming in the dim light. In a final act of desperation, Marissa grabbed the nearest instrument, a scalpel, and thrust it into the creature's throat. It didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. The scalpel was useless. The creature, now fully transformed, tore into her once more. Her screams echoed through the morgue, but no one could hear them. Back upstairs, Dr. Michaels and the other staff members were finally aware that something had gone horribly wrong. They rushed to the morgue, but by the time they arrived, the door was locked and the sounds inside were too horrifying to describe. When they finally forced the door open, what they found was beyond comprehension. Marissa was gone. The room was drenched in blood, and in the center of the chaos stood a corpse, moving, twitching, like it had never been dead at all. The body of the nurse, who had once been so full of life, now stood before them, a lifeless shell of her former self. And just like that, the first real sign of the undead appeared. The hospital was never the same again. What had begun as a strange illness had now evolved into something far worse, something no one could have predicted. The world they had known was gone. The nightmare had only just begun. The infection spread like wildfire. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when things had taken a turn for the worse. But once the virus had started, there was no stopping it. It was as if something ancient and malevolent had been unleashed upon the city, something that no one could comprehend or control. The media called it a pandemic. though that word felt inadequate for what was actually happening. In the early days, it seemed like just another flu outbreak. People coughing, sneezing, a few fatalities here and there. But soon, the symptoms were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. People's skin began to decay. Their eyes turned red and bloodshot. They grew aggressive, and soon, the deaths started to come faster. At first, no one made the connection, but then, people didn't just die. They came back. The first few incidents were written off as freak occurrences. Authorities assumed it was just some sort of bizarre medical anomaly, a reaction to a virus, or an experimental treatment gone wrong. But it didn't take long for the truth to become undeniable. The infection wasn't just making people sick. It was turning them into something else entirely. The infected didn't remain in their graves. They didn't stay down. They got up. They walked, and they attacked. The government scrambled to respond, but it was too late. It spread too quickly, and no one knew how to stop it. As the infection raged through the population, fear began to consume the city. People who had been walking down the street just days before were now dead, or worse, undead. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, left to the chaos that followed. Stores were emptied as people hoarded food, medical supplies, and anything that might help them survive. The streets, once full of life, were now empty, save for the occasional lone survivor. The fear was palpable in the air. People locked themselves inside their homes, sealing doors and windows, creating barricades to keep out the growing horde of monsters that now roamed freely. The sense of safety that had once been a hallmark of the city was gone. Now, it was just a place of constant danger. What was even more terrifying was that the zombies weren't confined to any specific area. They were everywhere. They didn't just roam the streets or wait for nightfall. They broke into buildings, smashed through windows, and wandered through alleyways in broad daylight. No one was safe. The streets became a dangerous maze of destruction, and even the once bustling shopping districts were now eerily quiet. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, some with the keys still in the ignition. Buildings were left empty, doors left wide open, and in every corner, bloodstains marred the ground. In the early days, there was a small hope that the worst was over, that the military would step in and restore order. But as days passed, that hope quickly turned to despair. The military had been overwhelmed, and the government seemed unable to do anything. Chicago, once a beacon of strength and progress, was now a city teetering on the edge of total collapse. The nighttime was when the true horrors began. The sound of moaning and growling echoed through the empty streets. The unnerving scrape of undead hands dragging against windows and doors searching for any living soul foolish enough to be caught outside. People huddled in their homes, praying they wouldn't be the next victims. The city's once vibrant neighborhoods were now nothing more than ghost towns, with the occasional flicker of a streetlight casting long, dragging light, haunting shadows. It was in this chaos that a small group of survivors came together. They didn't know each other before the outbreak, but circumstances had forced them to form an unlikely alliance. Sam, a former police officer, had been trained to deal with crisis situations. He wasn't the type to panic. He knew what he needed to do to stay alive. And now that his city had fallen into madness, he was doing whatever it took to survive. He wasn't alone for long. A nurse who had been working at a hospital when the outbreak began found herself in the same situation. She had been trapped in the city with no family to rely on. Her medical knowledge gave her an advantage, and her calm under pressure made her a natural leader. And then there was Ethan, a teenager who had been caught in the chaos when his parents were killed. He had no family left, no one to turn to, but he was resourceful, quick-witted, and surprisingly strong for someone his age. Together, they formed an unlikely team, bound together by the need to survive. The group initially stayed in Linda's apartment. It was relatively safe, high up in a building that had been abandoned by most residents. They had barricaded themselves inside, waiting to see what would happen next, trying to stay out of the way of the infected. But as days passed, they realized that they couldn't just hide forever. They needed a plan. The infected were everywhere, and the city was quickly becoming a war zone. The group was running out of food, and they knew it was only a matter of time before their supplies ran out completely. More importantly, they realized that the city was not going to get better. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. If they didn't do something soon, there would be no safe places left. Ethan was the first to suggest they go into the heart of the city. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice full of determination. "We need to find out where this all started. If we don't, we're just waiting to die." Sam looked at him with a mix of disbelief and reluctant agreement. He knew Ethan was right. The city wasn't getting any safer. The longer they waited, the more desperate their situation would become. Linda nodded, glancing around at the others. They all knew the risks. The heart of the city was a dangerous place. It was filled with infected, and those who ventured out rarely came back. But there was no other choice. If they were going to survive, they had to find a way to end this outbreak before it was too late. The plan was risky, but it was the only option left. They gathered what little supplies they had left, checked their weapons, and set out. As they left the apartment, the silence of the streets hit them hard. It was unnerving, to say the least. The world they had known had disappeared, replaced by this nightmarish version of reality. The city, once filled with bustling life and hope, was now nothing more than a hushed cemetery. The group moved carefully through the deserted streets, staying low, avoiding the undead that roamed in search of fresh flesh. The smell of death lingered in the air, and every creak of a floorboard or rustle of a nearby trash can felt like an alarm. The once beautiful buildings now stood as hollow shells, their windows shattered and their doors kicked in. The city had fallen, and it was only a matter of time before the survivors did as well. But Sam, Linda, and Ethan were determined. They had no choice but to keep moving, no choice but to face whatever horrors awaited them in the heart of Chicago. As they ventured deeper into the chaos, one thing became clear. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the very future of the city, and perhaps the world itself. And if they didn't find a way to stop the outbreak soon, it would be the end of everything. As the survivors moved deeper into the heart of the decimated city, the once bustling streets now eerily silent, except for the occasional shuffle of the undead. A heavy sense of dread seemed to hang over them. Each step felt like a decision that would seal their fate. But there was no turning back. Sam, Linda, and Ethan knew that they had to keep moving forward if they were going to stand any chance of uncovering the truth behind this outbreak. But as they navigated the empty, decrepit streets of Chicago, they began to hear whispers, rumors that had spread among the few remaining survivors they encountered along the way. Some said it was a virus, an engineered pathogen perhaps, a bioweapon gone wrong. Others insisted it was the result of a government experiment, a failed attempt to create something powerful, something that could control the population. But the more they listened, the more they realized that these rumors didn't fit. There was something deeper, something far more ancient and sinister at play here. One evening, as they searched the wreckage of an old bookstore near the downtown area, they found something that would change everything. It wasn't much at first, just an old, leather-bound journal buried beneath a pile of rubble. Its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed with age, but there was something about it that caught Sam's attention. He picked it up carefully, brushing the dust off its cover. The journal was written by someone who had lived in the city long before the outbreak. Its author's name was barely legible. The ink faded and smeared, but the words inside were chilling. The journal described the city's origins in detail. It told of a time long ago, before the tall skyscrapers and busy streets, when Chicago was nothing more than a patch of wild land inhabited by indigenous tribes. But that all changed when European settlers arrived, bringing with them their hunger for power, land, and resources. The city's founders, eager to build their new empire, struck a dark and dangerous deal. They built Chicago on sacred ground that had once been a burial site for the indigenous people, a place where the dead were meant to rest in peace. According to the journal, the settlers made a pact with an ancient, malevolent force that they believed would bless their new city with prosperity and power. They didn't understand the full extent of what they were doing, but they sealed the deal with blood. The land, tainted by this dark pact, became the foundation upon which the city was built. But as the years passed, the land's curse was forgotten, buried beneath layers of progress and urban development. The journal went on to explain that this curse was far from just a myth. It had been brewing silently for centuries. The dead had never truly rested. They had been disturbed by the settlers, their graves desecrated by the builders of the city. In the years that followed, the curse grew stronger, its power reaching into every corner of Chicago. But it wasn't until much later, when the city began to expand and developers started digging deeper into the earth, that the curse finally awoke. The journal's author described how the city's rapid development began to disturb the graves beneath the city streets. As construction workers dug through the foundations, they unknowingly awakened something ancient. Something that had been buried deep beneath the earth. It was a force so powerful that it could raise the dead from their graves, transforming them into something far worse than mere corpses. They became the first of the zombies, undead creatures driven by an insatiable hunger, unable to rest until they consumed every living soul in the city. Sam flipped through the pages, the weight of the words beginning to settle in his chest. The further he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an outbreak. It wasn't a virus, a rogue experiment, or a natural disaster. What was happening in Chicago was the result of a curse. The dead were rising because they had been disturbed, and the city itself was built on a foundation of darkness, where the spirits of the dead had never truly been allowed to rest. The real horror, though, was yet to come. The journal explained that the curse wasn't just tied to the land. It was tied to the very essence of the city itself. The undead weren't just victims of some random outbreak. They were the spirits of the city's past, the restless souls of those who had been buried beneath the streets, long before Chicago ever became a metropolis. The curse had bound them to the land, and as the city grew, so did their power. The more people that inhabited the land, the stronger the curse became. And now the city's past was coming back to claim what it was owed. The zombies weren't just reanimated corpses. They were the vengeful spirits of the city, cursed to rise again and again until they had consumed every living being in Chicago. Once the city was empty, once every last... Sam closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. The city wasn't just under siege by the undead. It was under siege by the wrath of an ancient curse that had been building for centuries. And the worst part? There was no end in sight. The curse was tied to the city itself. There was no escaping it. Even if they managed to get out, they would never be free from its grasp. The dead would always rise again, and the city would never truly be safe. Linda, who had been standing silently behind him, now stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What does this mean for us?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, standing by the window, turned away from the glass. His face was... Sam nodded grimly. He had never believed in the supernatural, never thought much of old legends or ghost stories. But as he stood there, holding the journal in his hands, he couldn't deny what he had just read. This was no ordinary plague. This was something far older, far more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. The curse had been awakened, and they were caught in its grasp. The group fell into silence, each of them grappling with the enormity of what they had just discovered. There was no escaping the truth. Chicago was doomed. The dead would never stop rising, and there would be no peace for the living until every soul had been consumed. They were running out of time. The city was already lost. The only question now was whether they could find a way to stop the curse before it was too late. But Sam, Linda, and Ethan all knew the terrifying truth. There was no way to stop something this old, this powerful. The city was already in the grip of the curse, and they were just trying to survive in a world that had already been condemned. The survivors knew, deep down, that they could no longer just hide. They could no longer just avoid the zombies, hoping that they would somehow pass them by. The world around them had already been consumed by chaos, and every day spent running was a day lost. They had seen too much, experienced too much. The undead were everywhere, and this city was lost. But there was a way to end it. There had to be. Sam, Linda, and Ethan had spent days, maybe even weeks, carefully piecing together the clues from the journal they had found. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The curse was real. The undead were not just mindless creatures of infection. They were the result of an ancient pact, a dark force tied to the land itself. To defeat the zombies, to end the terror that had consumed Chicago, they needed to confront the source of the curse. But where? Where could they find the place that had caused it all? The journal had mentioned an old church buried deep beneath the city, a place where the curse had been first summoned, a place of unspeakable rituals. The survivors were now desperate enough to follow the faintest of clues, clinging to the hope that somewhere, deep beneath the crumbling streets of Chicago, the key to ending it all remained hidden. The journey to the church was long and dangerous. They traversed through abandoned streets, dodging hordes of zombies that roamed aimlessly. The city had become a graveyard, and it seemed like every step they took brought them closer to death. But with every corner they turned, with every abandoned building they passed, they knew they were getting closer to the heart of the darkness. Finally, they found it. Hidden beneath the remnants of a dilapidated building, the entrance to the underground church was well concealed. It was as if the city itself had tried to bury this dark history, to keep it hidden away from the world. But there it was, a massive stone door covered in ivy and grime, waiting for them to push it open. The door creaked as they opened it, the darkness inside stretching out like a void. They descended the crumbling staircase, their footsteps echoing eerily in the cold, damp air. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the very walls seeming to close in on them. The further they ventured into the bowels of the earth, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavy, thick with something ancient, something wrong. It was as though the weight of centuries pressed down on them. They reached the bottom, and before them stood an ancient stone altar, bathed in an unnatural, flickering light. The altar was stained with dark, dried blood. Scattered around it were old, cracked ritualistic tools, remnants of a time long forgotten. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and as they stepped forward, the very air around them seemed to whisper. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she surveyed the place. "This is where it all began," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sam nodded grimly, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He could feel the unease growing in his gut, but he knew there was no turning back. The curse had to be broken, or else the city would be lost forever. They approached the altar cautiously, every step heavy with dread. But as they drew closer, the ground beneath them suddenly cracked. It was as though the very earth was alive, groaning and shifting. Sam's eyes widened as he heard a low rumble, like thunder echoing from deep within the earth. Before they could react, the ground split open, and from the dark void beneath, hundreds of undead hands shot up, pulling their rotting bodies from the earth. The survivors scrambled back, the overwhelming stench of death and decay assaulting their senses. The zombies clawed their way out of the cracks in the earth, rising from the very ground itself. Their eyes were hollow, their skin falling off in chunks, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air was filled with the sound of moaning, growling, and the sickening sound of bones snapping back into place as the dead rose to life once more. It was a battle for their lives. Sam and Linda fought fiercely, their weapons slicing through the undead ranks as they pushed forward toward the altar. Sam swung his crowbar, smashing skulls with precision, while Linda fought with everything she had, her medical knowledge helping her target. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed close to the altar. He could feel the dark energy radiating from it, pulling him closer, as if it were calling to him. The book from the journal, the ancient tome they had discovered in the library, had to be close. His eyes darted around, scanning the altar, desperate to find what they needed. His heart raced as his fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the stone altar. A thick, ancient book bound in black leather. With trembling hands, Ethan pulled the book free, his breath shallow with fear and anticipation. As he flipped through the pages, he found what he was looking for: an incantation, an ancient ritual that could break the curse. The words seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly light, and Ethan could feel the power of the words calling to him, beckoning him to speak them. He didn't have much time. The undead were closing in, and his friends were fighting for their lives. With a glance at Sam and Linda, who were surrounded by the growing horde, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He had to do this now, or it would all be for nothing. With a deep breath, Ethan recited the incantation, his voice shaking but resolute. The words were foreign, ancient, their meaning lost to time. But the power behind them was undeniable. As he spoke the final word, the ground beneath them trembled, the very air growing thick with a crackling energy. The undead let out a horrifying scream, their bodies writhing and convulsing as though they were being torn apart from within. Suddenly, the altar erupted in a blinding light. The air became electric, charged with a force that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The undead around them froze, their movements ceasing, their moans dying in their throats. In an instant, the ground shook violently. Sam and Linda shielded themselves from the falling debris, but all around them, the zombies began to disintegrate, their bodies crumbling into dust as the curse that had bound them was finally broken. It was over. The survivors stood in the wreckage of the church, breathless and trembling. The sound of their heavy breathing was the only noise in the aftermath. The oppressive silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. The undead had vanished, their bodies reduced to nothing but ash. The curse that had plagued Chicago for centuries had been broken. The city. But even as they stood there, victorious yet exhausted, the survivors knew that their world had changed forever. The darkness that had once consumed the city was gone, but the scars left by the curse would never fully fade. They had fought for their lives, and they had won. But the cost was high, and the battle had taken more from them than they cared to admit. As the sun began to rise over the remains of Chicago, Sam, Linda, and Ethan knew that they had survived. They had fought for the city, for each other, and for the future. But in the back of their minds, the question remained: had they truly ended the curse? Or had they simply postponed its return? The streets of Chicago were eerily silent, a heavy stillness hanging over the city, as if the very air had been sucked dry of life. The winds, once filled with the sounds of honking horns, the chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of a bustling metropolis, now blew through empty streets and abandoned buildings. The sound of distant sirens, the occasional rumble of thunder, and the creak of buildings settling were the only sounds that disturbed the quiet. The undead were gone, their bodies reduced to dust, their curse broken by the survivors' desperate actions. But despite their victory, something in the air felt unsettled, as though the city itself was mourning, holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. The survivors, Sam, Linda, and Ethan, had emerged from the depths of the ruined church, battered and exhausted, but alive. They had fought through the darkest horrors imaginable, driven by a desperate need to survive. They had faced the dead, watched as the city crumbled, and discovered the terrible truth behind the curse that had gripped Chicago for centuries. And in the end, they had succeeded. They had broken the curse. But it had come at a great cost. The city, once full of life, was now nothing more than a wasteland. What had once been gleaming skyscrapers and bustling markets was now rubble and dust. Homes, schools, parks, and businesses had all been reduced to ruins. The familiar skyline was barely recognizable. The once proud landmarks now standing like broken sentinels, unable to protect the city any longer. The streets that had once echoed with the laughter of children and the footsteps of workers were now empty save for the survivors who walked the streets, unsure of what to do next. The city had been irreparably scarred, not just physically, but emotionally. The memories of the friends and families they had lost, the people they had tried to save, and the horrors they had witnessed would haunt them forever. For Sam, Linda, and Ethan, the aftermath was a bittersweet victory. They had lived through the nightmare, but they had paid a heavy price. They had lost so much, so many lives, so many friends, and in some cases, a part of their own humanity. Sam, who had once been a hardened police officer, now felt the weight of the city's collapse pressing on him. He had always been the one to step into danger, to protect those around him. But in the end, even his training hadn't been enough to save everyone. The faces of the victims haunted him, the screams of those he couldn't help still echoing in his mind. Linda, the nurse who had fought so hard to save lives, now walked through the wreckage with a weary look in her eyes. She had seen death before, but never like this. The endless suffering, the brutality of the undead, those were things no one should ever have to witness. Ethan, the teenager who had lost his parents to the outbreak, now carried the weight of survival on his young shoulders. He had watched everything he had ever known vanish in an instant. The loss had left him changed, and although he had fought bravely, he knew that he would never be the same. As they walked through the wreckage of the city, trying to make sense of the destruction around them, they couldn't help but feel that something still wasn't right. There was a sense of wrongness that lingered in the air, a feeling that they hadn't truly escaped the nightmare. The city was quieter than it had ever been, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a hollow silence, a silence that felt like the calm before a storm. The wind, cold and biting, seemed to whisper their names, its eerie howls like a warning that no one could ignore. Sam looked around, his hand instinctively resting on the weapon at his side. It was as if the very wind carried a message, a warning that they hadn't truly defeated the curse, that the city was still holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They moved cautiously through the streets, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows, their senses heightened from months of survival. The familiar landmarks, once symbols of strength, now felt like tombstones marking the graves of their loved ones. Everything had changed. The city was no longer the place they had known. And as they walked, they couldn't help but feel that there was something watching them. something lurking just beyond their sight. In the distance, Sam noticed a shadow, a figure standing against the backdrop of the ruined city. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light. But as they drew closer, he realized that it was no illusion. A figure stood in the wreckage, watching them silently from the edge of a broken building. The figure was tall, draped in tattered clothing, their face obscured by a dark hood. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply watched, their presence unsettling, as if they were waiting for something. Sam's hand went to his gun, his instincts kicking in. But Linda, who had been walking beside him, grabbed his arm, stopping him. "It's not a threat," she said, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "It's just someone else who survived." But even as she said it, there was doubt in her voice. The figure didn't act like someone who was simply trying to survive. There was something about them that didn't belong in the world they had just emerged from. The feeling of unease deepened, and the wind seemed to pick up again, carrying with it the faintest whisper. A voice, low and distant, carried through the air, but it was too faint to make out. Sam and Linda exchanged a glance, both sensing that they weren't alone in this broken city, that somehow the terror they had faced hadn't truly ended. Ethan, too, had noticed the figure. He had been staring at the ground, lost in thought. But something about the figure's stillness had caught his attention. He raised his head, his eyes meeting the figure's for just a moment. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively stepped closer to Sam and Linda, though he couldn't explain why. The feeling in the air was thick, like the city itself was holding its breath, as if something dark was still lurking beneath the surface. But before they could get any closer, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, melting into the wreckage like a ghost. They didn't chase it. There was no point. They had already faced enough horrors to last a lifetime. But still, the figure's presence gnawed at them, an unsettling reminder that they weren't done, that maybe the curse wasn't over. Maybe it was just waiting. Waiting. The survivors continued their journey through the desolate streets, the weight of what they had done and what they had lost pressing down on them. The question remained in their minds. Had they truly destroyed the curse? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting to return when they least expected it? The city might have fallen silent for now, but the terror that had once consumed it would never truly be forgotten. The memory of the undead, the smell of death, the faces of those they had lost would haunt them forever. Chicago had fallen, and though the legend of the zombies might have ended, the city's dark past would always linger, a constant reminder of the horrors that had once risen from beneath its streets. The survivors had won, yes, but at what cost? The future was uncertain, and the shadows that clung to the ruins of the city